I'm Gilly MacMillan, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Tim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Gilly MacMillan.
Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are links in the right-hand sidebar where you can subscribe to the show on any platform that you listen to podcasts on. hankgarner.com, where you can listen on the site or subscribe everywhere. Today's show is brought to you by Grammarly, an intelligent writing app. Download Grammarly's browser extension and create a free Grammarly account at www.getgrammarly.com/Hank. That's www.getgrammarly.com/Hank. Grammarly is an excellent tool that will help you get your document that you're working on in shape before sending it off to your editor for that final pass. If you need that first look, Grammarly is the place to go. Also, for all of your correspondence on the web, Grammarly can help you make sure that you're saying what you intend to say. Get Grammarly.com/Hank. Also, thanks to my buddy C. Stephen Manley for sponsoring the show. His book, Master of Hounds, The Pickman Files, Book 1, is one of my favorite urban fantasy books that have come out this year. Chuck has been on the show before. He's one of the hosts of Keystroke Medium, one of my favorite group of guys, and one of my favorite podcasts out there. Master of Hounds, The Pickman Files, Book 1. Clint Mercer is about to get a crash course in magic. I love this book. I know you will too. Pick up Master of Hounds today. There's a link to it in the show notes. We'll talk more about it as the month goes on. Now on to our author interview for today. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Gilly MacMillan on the show with me today. She has a fantastic new book called I Know You Know. And let me tell you guys, I've been reading this book for, I got it a couple of weeks ago, and this is a tremendous read. This is one of those keep you up at night, keep the pages turning, because you have to know how this book ends. I'm really excited to have you on the show today, Gilly. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Hank. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, Gilly, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Gosh, that's a very difficult one to recall. For as long as I can remember, I've been an absolutely obsessive reader. I was one of those kids who, as soon as she could read, had a book in her hands every single minute of the day that I possibly could. So although I perhaps didn't know I wanted to be a writer back then, I think the words and books and reading got into my blood probably from about 4 or 5 years old, or whatever the age is that I learned to read.
What kinds of books did you like to read when you were younger?
I read a huge variety, but I was a real tomboy. So mostly what I loved were adventures. And I read, there was a series of stories about two brothers called Hal and Roger, and they had different titles around the world, like Deep Sea Adventure and Underwater Adventure, and those were my favorite books. But I also enjoyed classics like Black Beauty and all sorts of things. Yeah, I just couldn't get enough of them.
At what point did you discover mysteries and kind of thriller-esque books?
As an adult, I think I was at the point where I wanted a really fast, light read. And when I say light, I don't mean not a good read. I mean something that really thrills you, entertains you, and takes you along for the ride. And one of the first books that really got me in that respect was a book called No Time for Goodbye by Linwood Barclay. And I thought that one absolutely seized me. And I thought, goodness, this is just fantastic. And I couldn't wait to buy more. And that started a bit of an obsession, really.
What did you do career-wise when you were grown? You'd been this obsessive book lover, and probably that knowing was in there somewhere that one day I'm going to write a book. But for most of us, we decide that we need to pay some bills along the way and, become, proper
Absolutely.
adults and
Yes.
and things like that. What did you decide to do, career-wise when you left school and set out on your own?
So the first thing I did was go to university, and I began to study French and discovered that I was way out of my depth, if I'm honest. So I wanted to switch to English literature, but I wasn't allowed to. The course was full, and they told me there was an opening in art history. And I'd never studied it, and I thought, oh, what kind of terrible degree subject is that, where you just look at pictures and it sounds terrible. But I went to a few lectures, and it enchanted me. So I switched to study single honours art history, and I did that for 3 years and loved it, and then did a master's, and then set to work in the art world in London. And my first job was selling pictures, but I wasn't very good at that. So then I went into more kind of public exhibition space, and I worked at the Hayward Gallery in London as an assistant to the head of exhibitions, and that was a terrific job.
I believe that all forms of art and expression are connected on some level. That when it really gets down to the root of it all, we're all telling stories. We're all sharing our views, our experiences with the human condition, or with something that moves people, even if it's landscapes or something. If it hits us on an emotional level, then it's ultimately a human expression. What do you feel that working in art and art history, how do you feel like that affected your writing, or can you draw a line from those two things?
Oh, no, I think I'm in total agreement with you. I think all forms of art are so interlinked, you can't really separate them. And I suppose when I was studying art and working in that world, I was absolutely smitten by beauty. And I suppose of the pieces I liked, that is, and I suppose what I mean by that are those are the ones that touched me emotionally. And I think you're absolutely right that that's the most powerful way in which art affects us. And on a more practical level, being an art historian, training to be an art historian, it teaches you to describe what you see and translate what you see into how it affects you emotionally. You have to get that down on paper. And I think that was terrific training for writing fiction.
So you're working in this world, you're selling, art and working, in that, form. What awakened in you that desire again to write fiction?
Well, I had a little bit of a journey before that happened. I started a family,
Okay.
and I had to quit my job because we left London. So I started a family and took up teaching photography, which is another passion of mine. And then my youngest child became very unwell, so I had to stop working altogether to look after him. He's very well now. It was a happy ending. But once my kids, so I stayed off, I was a housewife, and I stayed off work until all 3 kids started school. And that was the moment where I thought, oh, you know what? I might see if I can write, because I would never have been brave enough to quit a salaried job to do it, I don't think, if I'm honest.
Right.
But I felt like I had this little window of time where I needed to get a job, we needed the money, but I didn't need to quite that moment. So I took a punt and I went for it, and I had a go at writing a book in that time.
That, there's so many, I've heard a variation of that story so many times that, it's some circumstance, that intervenes in life and makes the decision for us that we never would have made, for ourselves. And, a lot of times it's something, I won't say tragic, but, sometimes it is tragedy, but sometimes it's just some sort of hardship or something. And it pushes you out of your comfort zone. Art is a lot like that a lot of times the best stuff is born out of, a difficult situation or, us being completely out of our depth or something like that. Do you agree?
I totally agree. I think very difficult situations push you into places you didn't think you would ever go or could ever go. And so they strengthen you in some ways and they remove you from the normal run of things and they find a rawness in you. And I think all of those three things can feed into art in very interesting ways.
Yeah. So your first book that you published, Burnt Paper Sky, or as it's known internationally, What She Knew, was that the first book that you wrote?
Yes, that was the one. Yeah.
What was the catalyst for that story?
I had played around with a couple of other ideas, one being a historical fiction book, which I also love, but it was clear that the research would take too long and I wouldn't get the thing written in under a year. So I figured that I'd write a thriller because that's obviously my other love in terms of what I read. And I like domestic thrillers. I found them very relatable as a housewife at the time with kids. And I thought, what would my worst nightmare be as a mother? And the simple answer was to have a child disappear and not know where they were or what was happening to them.
Right. Domestic thrillers. I like you, I think those are some of the most fascinating stories because the stakes are so high, usually. I think that, I hate a lot of genre, distinctions because I think, and I know we need to label things so that we know what we're talking about and so we know where to buy them in the bookstore and all that. But, I think, sometimes, like that distinction, it puts off some readers, like maybe men are not drawn to those stories, as much sometimes because they think that it's, this is about housewives and this is not about me. And I could not disagree more, as a father, and as a husband, there are no greater stakes than your family being in trouble. Do you ever get, comments from readers, that maybe, wow, I didn't expect this from this book, but this has, really, gotten me where it matters?
Yes, I have had a few comments like that. And when I planned that book, my first draft was written all from the mother's point of view, the mother of the missing child. And when I reread it myself before it even went to an agent, I thought it was okay, but it felt too intense. So when I came to have an agent and we worked on it, we thought, well, a way to kind of counteract this idea that it's just a book for women would be to cut the detective's point of view through. He's a male detective. And so that's why my first novel is structured like that. You jump from hearing his point of view and how the investigation is progressing to hearing the mother's point of view of what it's like to live through it. And that was a really interesting thing. And it was almost a deliberate act to try and counter that idea that you mentioned that these books are just for women.
Yeah, I could, and I love that you did that, with cutting the detective's point of view. When you started writing this book, how difficult was it to get into the thriller mindset, as a writer? Having not done this before, and I know that you're a big fan of the genre, but was it difficult to kind of put yourself in that, out of your idyllic, daily life and into, peril and, things that are not what you generally experience?
Yeah, it was. And I have to say there are days when I think, why am I doing this? It's exhausting because, of course, as soon as you finish one, you leap into another sort of perilous world of the next novel. I don't find it that difficult to jump into that mindset. I quite like it. But it does require quite a lot of adrenaline to kind of get a good voice and a good tone and keep that tension up. So I do find it really tiring. Funny, I'm emotionally exhausted by the end of a day of simply just sitting there, which surprised me. But I wonder if that's not necessary to get the words to actually mean something and have a heart and attention in them.
Right. I was talking on the show a little while back with Sean and Nikki, who write under the pseudonym Nikki French, and we had this great conversation about how people that write crime thrillers or these stories where this horrible stuff happens. They are usually the sweetest people in the whole world. But these crazy stories, come out of their mind. And we had a good laugh about it. But, it's kind of odd that these kind of stories resonate so deeply with so many people. And the genre right now is just uber hot. Is it because we do lead such sheltered lives for the most part that, sticking our toe in danger, kind of does something for our primordial self, where we need to feel, danger, yet we need to do it from the comfort of our own home?
I think that's absolutely right. But I also believe, that it plays a little bit with our sense of ourselves, because speaking for myself, I'm not always nice. I'm not always good. And over the years, I probably have done a few things that I've regretted. And I think you can play with your ideas about yourself in terms of, well, what would I do in that situation? Would I be good? How far would I go to protect my family? Who would I be loyal to in this situation? And I think thrillers can allow us to question those things. They're not always comfortable questions, and I'm not sure everybody would do it, but I certainly think they can tap into that side of life as well.
Right. Well, I think that's a really great point, is that thrillers also allow us to kind of go to the basest nature of ourselves and what would we do to protect our family, and nothing will trigger that in you like having your family harmed. There's you don't know what you would do until you're in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I think it's really interesting in this day and age. And I wonder if it's why they're so popular, because it's such a contrast to the way everybody presents themselves on social media. All this perfection in pictures and comments and likes, etc., that many of us do. And, the darker areas of life, there's often not a place for them, and it's hard to know how to address them. And I think fiction can do that.
Oh, what a really great point. Yeah. Our facades are only so thick, and this allows us to show that a little bit. I really like that. So you wrote the book. What was your process for, so you're a stay-at-home mom, and you've written this book. Had you had any experience with publishing at all? Did you know the ins and outs of the industry, or did you just kind of go into it blind?
I went in pretty blind. When I met my husband a long, long time ago, he was working in publishing, but he was so junior. We were both doing those kind of entry-level jobs at the time. So he had some really outdated views or a kind of experience of publishing. It was about 25 years old by the time I was interested in getting published. So no, I did what everyone does in the UK. There's a book called The Writers and Artists Yearbook, and you buy a copy, and it's updated every year, and it lists all the agents and publishers and what their interests are. And I flicked through it and picked some agents out to send the manuscript to.
Nice. How long did it take, and how many rejections did you rack up?
I was very lucky. I chose 3 agents who took online submissions because I figured that was cheaper than printing out the manuscript. And I sent it to, I think, 3 or 4, and I had one instant rejection, like so quick. It was, you think, oh, can't you at least give me hope for a month? And then nobody responded, and Christmas went past. I was a little half-hearted about it. I was very underconfident about the book, so I wasn't really pushing. So Christmas went by, and I thought, well, I have to apply for a job now. That's it. But I was just thinking I'll send it out to a few more just in case, when one of the original ones got back to me. It was about 2 months later. And she said, I like it. I want the rest of the manuscript. And I had this kind of reality check, and I thought, I know the rest of the manuscript's not very good. So I told a little fib, and I said, I'm away and I don't have access to the manuscript. I'll send it to you in a week. And I stayed up day and night trying to improve it. And I sent it to her a week later, and she read it that day and called that afternoon. And she said, you can write. And she said, there are a million problems with this book, but if you're willing to work on it with me, I'm willing to represent you.
Wow.
So of course I said yes. Yeah. So I was very lucky. I didn't go through too many rounds of rejections.
Well, what a gift that she recognized the potential of the book and recognized that this would be a viable book if you just worked on it. That's a real gift for a debut author.
It was an absolute gift, and I just jumped on it as quickly as I could, and we worked on the book for almost a year together before we put it out on submission to publishers. So it was fantastic, and it's something I'd say to all authors is, be prepared to work on your baby. Other people's input can be so brilliant when you've maybe run out of ideas or hit a wall.
The original title we mentioned earlier was Burnt Paper Sky, then published under the name What She Knew. What's the story behind the name change, and what did the original title mean?
The original title is I'm a huge fan of James Lee Burke. So when they asked me to come up with a title originally, I came up with Burnt Paper Sky because in my mind it sounded like a James Lee Burke title, which I thought was terrific. And I suggested it to the UK publishers, and they went with it. It was based on a line in the book. It's the moment the mother realizes her child is missing, and she looks up and she can see darkness creeping in, like when a piece of paper's burning and that blackness creeps in from the edges. So it relates to that moment in the book.
What a great image.
I love that image. It was so creepy in my head when I thought of it. The title was changed for the North American market. My American editors felt that it wasn't going to work, and they actually came up with What She Knew, which I thought was really good. So I was very happy to go with that.
Excellent. And since then, you published What She Knew, which was that one. The Perfect Girl, Odd Child out, and now we're up to your brand new book, which is out today. When people are hearing this, I Know You Know. Gilly, this being your fourth novel, is that right?
Yep. Yes.
So how has your process changed from that first novel, which, and we talk about this a lot, that first novel that no one knows you're writing, but maybe your spouse, maybe a close friend or relative, but for the most part, the world is not waiting for your first book because it's just you and the book. And a lot of times we take a year or two, whatever, to kind of mull that over, to kind of learn the craft of writing. But after that first book, the process becomes very different, doesn't it? So on your fourth book here, how have you changed as a writer from then to now?
You're absolutely right. Everything you say is right. I have learned to get quicker. I was such a rookie when I wrote my first book. I made every single mistake you can think of. I hadn't even done a creative writing class or anything. So I think one of the advantages I have now that I'm on book number 4 is that I make fewer mistakes on the basics like pacing and, characters, that kind of thing. I still make a lot of mistakes. I've learned to, I write my first draft more quickly because I know that it's going to be very rough. It's like one of my editors referred to a first draft as just a piece of clay on the table. And once you've got it there, you can start working it into something more refined. So I try and get that done as quickly as possible. I really try and put my faith in my characters' voices because that's one thing that's always come quite easily for me as opposed to other things like structure and plot. So I kind of and I try not to think about expectations. It's tough when you get lost in that. I find myself stalling and panicking, and that's when your confidence can take a bit of a dip. So for me, I find it best to block all that out and just crack on and focus on the story.
Right. This book is different from your first book in that that first book is very a domestic thriller, like we mentioned earlier. We've got that very raw emotion of the mother and her child, and it's very, very close to the heart. This book is a little different, although I would say that the tension is ratcheted just the same, but from a different perspective. So on this one, we've got someone who has Cody Swift, our protagonist. His friends were murdered when they were 11 years old. I think it was, is it 11?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, when they were young kids. And he's lived, so now we're 20 years later, but he's lived with this, the story of his kids, of his friends being murdered when they were kids. And then things kind of start unraveling, for him. How did you choose Cody, to tell this story about, and, where did this idea come from?
I read about a cold case here in the UK about a murder of two boys. It wasn't identical, but it has similarities to the case that I constructed for I Know You Know, because it was unresolved, and I couldn't stop thinking about how that would feel 20 years later if somebody came along and started to dig around and unearth the case all over again, for all the families involved. And at the same time, I was listening to a Canadian podcast called Somebody Knows Something, and the podcaster himself returned to his hometown to look into a case that had happened when he was a child. And so those two ideas kind of came together, and gave me a setup for I Know You Know, which I was really excited about right from the start, partly because I'm fascinated by how things change over time. Particularly in those crucial years from when we're a child to when we kind of hit our stride as adults in our 30s.
Right. Cody, your main protagonist, is a filmmaker in the book. What did having him as a filmmaker, what did that open up for you in the storytelling of this?
I think it implies he's knows how to tell a story. We feel in safe hands with him because he knows how to put together a story, and he's obviously quite visual. So I think at times when he's podcasting, he can conjure things up quite vividly. So that was useful to me as well. And I think he's in tune with people, as you have to be if you're creating, podcasts or films or anything like that. You've got to be able to read other people, and that was important to me as well. I wanted the reader to know that he had some insight to want to go where he goes.
Right. What did having the device of the story be, the initial story being 20 years old, and I know that the story evolves and we're brought into the present with what's going on, and I'm trying not to give away too much. I'll let you say what you want to say, but the initial thing is this is 20 years old. This is a cold case, whereas some of your other books are immediate and the events are unfolding in front of our eyes, so to speak. How did having this start as a cold case, did that open new possibilities for you? Did that allow you to kind of bury the lead of the story and bring us into it? Just talk a little bit about the writing of those two different things, a story, a crime that did happen versus something that is happening.
What it meant initially, and actually throughout the writing process, was it was just the most complicated plot I have ever had to put together. My second book, The Perfect Girl, was told over 48 hours, and that was much, much simpler. I thought rather ruefully about that as I was writing this. But it was a fantastic challenge as a writer. There was so much to bring to life. You had these cast of characters in the present and a cast of characters in the past. Some of them were in both. And I just felt kind of absolutely thrilled by the possibilities of it all. And if I hadn't kept control, I probably could have written a 600-page book about it all. So it was complicated, but it was exciting. And it was one of the best bits was editing it, because there's always fluff when you edit. There's always stuff that shouldn't be there. And it was an extraordinary, satisfying process to really strip this book back to what was really important in both these stories and see the ways in which they kind of interconnect with each other.
When you're writing a story like this one, and you are weaving the plot points together, well, first off, are you an intricate plotter from the beginning, and how much pre-writing goes into you telling the story, or are you a kind of by the seat of the pants writer?
I'm a total seat of the pants writer, and I wish I wasn't. I aspire to be a plotter, but when I try, I get a kind of grey mist. I can't get the ideas flowing till I'm in it, till I know who my characters are. My agent has a rule, says you have to know the end before you start. So I kind of usually roughly know the end, but that's it.
So what comes to you first? Do the characters come to you, or you mentioned that you got a couple of ideas for kind of the scenario that then melded together into this, but does a character come to you first, or do you have a situation and then the characters arrive in that situation? How does it usually take form? I
think the first thing is probably a situation, but the characters crowd in really, really quickly after that. Right. It always seems very logical when I think of who the characters are. There's usually one just standing there, like the keen kid in class with their hand up going, cast me. And I think that's really the order it goes in. So I kind of have this very vivid image of what my first scenes will be, and I usually just go for it and write that and then see where it takes me.
One thing that I love about your books is your characters are so relatable, believable. It would be easy when you're writing these kinds of books, I would think, to just have the characters completely stressed out all of the time, completely running wide open, and but it would kind of be impossible to maintain that on a human level. What do you do as a writer to keep the tension ratcheted up, yet letting the reader take a breath every now and then, so that then when the tension ratchets up again, it means something. If it's just complete stress for 300 pages, that's not as powerful as, kind of the ebb and flow in the storytelling. I think there's a couple of things really to say there. I mean, first is that I really want my characters to be realistic. I'm delighted to hear you say that they're relatable, because that means a lot. It's what I always set out to do, because I'm frustrated when I read books where the characters are not relatable. And I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, where there's shades of grey and shades of tension in everybody, and you have to let your characters sometimes come down a bit, because that's what would happen in real life. Even if we're in tense situations, we'd die if we stayed in a hyper anxious state for any length of time. So I build that in, and because I tend to alternate narrators, you can build that in a bit for the reader by taking a break from one character who might be in a place of extreme tension and giving the reader a different character who's not quite there for whatever reason. And that's a really handy device for keeping things light, perhaps not light, but less stressful when they need to be. Right. And showing the characters going through the different emotions of what's going on helps as well, doesn't it? We don't respond and react completely the same way all the way through a situation, but giving some shade and some texture to those situations helps too, doesn't it?
Oh, I think it really does. And I think sometimes characters need to process information just the way we would in real life. And sometimes, when you learn something shocking, it takes you a while. Maybe what you think immediately isn't what you think the next day or the week later. And that kind of thing's really interesting to feed into a novel.
Yeah. One thing really interesting about I Know You Know is that we do have this cold case, but then the story, the case kind of opens up again, and we get to see how Cody is kind of an antagonist toward the other people that are involved in this, because not only were Cody's friends murdered, but those friends that were murdered have families, and after 20 years, some of those people had made peace as best as they could, and put it to rest. And then you've got this guy that comes in that kind of starts, opening old wounds and all of that stuff. How did that come to you? And was that important to have those old wounds reopened again that brings a whole different, tension to the story.
It really does. I'm a huge fan of true crime podcasts, and I listen to them all the time. And one of the things I really noticed is that frequently they're looking at cold cases, and some of the most powerful interviews you'll hear are with families of victims, and they're very, very often interviewed many years after the event, and they have such a range of reactions. Some of them just don't want to know. They've had enough. They've been through enough. They as you say, they've made peace. Whereas others are desperate still for closure, in terms of wanting to know what happened. So I found that fascinating, how different people react. And of course, it leads into a whole set of questions for law enforcement or investigators about whether somebody might have something to hide, or whether 20 years on people might be ready to talk because their lives have changed, and something they didn't want to come forward with at the time, they maybe would now, perhaps, for many reasons, could be at the root of that. So that whole thing I thought was a fascinating dynamic to have in the story.
Absolutely. Do you have a favorite true crime podcast that you could recommend to us?
There's two I particularly love. Somebody Knows Something, which is out of Canada, and then there's an Australian one called Australian True Crime, and that's terrific too.
Awesome. I'll look those up and link to them in the show notes.
Oh, fantastic.
How fun. Gilly, the book is out today. We're going to send everybody to go pick up a copy. And dear listeners, I've read this book. It is amazing. This is one of those rare books that's going to go on my favorite books of the year before the end, the year is even over yet. So it's going to make my list this year for sure. Gilly, if people are not familiar with you and your work, where can they find you online to dig into your back catalog and just get to know you better?
So I have a website, which is www.gillymacmillan.com, and I'm also all over social media under just my name, @Gilly MacMillan. I have a Facebook page where I regularly update readers on what's going on, so I'd love to see anybody there.
And Gilly is with a G.
It's with a G, yes.
Yeah, excellent. Gilly, I've enjoyed our talk so much. I'm a big fan of what you're doing. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Thank you so much, Hank. It's been so nice to chat to you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
What in the name of Carl Sagan was he doing in the cemetery on Halloween? What was he thinking? He whirled, expecting the Headless Horseman himself to be waiting on the road ahead. Or was he lurking behind? He wanted to run, but now the bridge ahead worried him. Doesn't the horseman haunt bridges? Could he avoid crossing it somehow? It terrified him. Why? It was just a stupid bridge. The gloom beneath could have been the lair of a troll. Billy Goat's Gruff. Mama used to read that. The troll waits beneath for the fattest, sweetest goat. Jason thought he saw something on the far end of the bridge, a shape of some sort. He stepped onto the bridge and gripped the knotty railing. He felt the ground drop away beneath as he edged forward. His eyes remained on the shape. It's nothing. It's nothing. Is it nothing? No troll attacked him as he reached the other shore. The looming shape was only a stupid stairwell opposite the bridge that climbed up the hill and into the main cemetery. He turned left and ran, admitting defeat and letting the fear take him over. He ran southward down the long, dark road. His initial burst of adrenaline ran its course and he slowed, then walked again, limping a little. Headstones slipped past on the right. He still had enough light that he caught his reflection occasionally in the polished stone. He looked very young and very thin. He could feel his vulnerability as he walked along. He grew aware of his own body, the touch of his starchy dress shirt and his jacket and the soft weight of his backpack. He saw himself reflected in the headstones, just a container of warm fluids, flimsy work for a blade or a hoof or a sword. He felt shatterable and transient, and his next breath was not guaranteed, oh no. The leaves made a faint oceanic rustle all around. The insects sang their three-note songs. Jason Crane, Jason Crane, Jason Crane. Jason sang a wretched pop song as he walked, something about having no self-control and no bitches and not enough money. He sang it softly, absent-mindedly, as if reciting a psalm. He passed Reese, Finnerton, Bain, Ekdal, Forest, Black, Small. There. He saw the gate at the end of the road. But the gate would be locked, he remembered. He would have to climb the embankment and cross over the churchyard. He could see the spire of the church above and the weather vane spinning against the sky. He would rather climb this gate than face that churchyard, but the spikes on top made leaping the fence impossible. Okay, just be quick. Something caught his ear, a brittle, clipping sound. He scanned the crest above and saw a horse silhouetted among the graves. It looked to be tied to a branch of the locust tree. He had heard its hooves as it shifted from foot to foot. It rustled somehow. His breath caught. He forced himself to be calm and rational. Some Halloween thing, maybe, for some event. He found the stairs and ascended, sideways, ready to bolt if necessary. He watched the horse, but when he neared the top he saw the rider, standing upon the shallow depression of the horseman's grave. The figure was motionless, a dim shape that absorbed light and gave nothing back. He could make out the shape of the boots and the legs and two arms held away from the body, palms down. Just a man? But the cape of the thing was not normal. It contorted painfully, twisting in the air even though the wind wasn't blowing. It wrung itself and billowed and whipped slowly, as if the figure wore a wave torn from a black ocean. And above its shoulders, is he headless? Is he headless?